this thrombus will be attached to the vessel's wall, right? But sometimes what happen? Sometimes some part of the thrombus will move in, along with the circulations. In that case, we have to use the word embolism, right? But many a time what happen? Many embolisms are actually derived from the thrombus. So many a time we use the both word together, thromboembolism, right? So most probably what happen here, the source of embolism will be thrombus. Okay, so the name given thromboembolism. Okay, so pulmonary thromboembolisms refers to both local thrombus formation as well as translocation of a thrombus present elsewhere in a venous circulation. Okay, so here you can see the list of etiology which are responsible for thromboembolisms in the lungs. They are again very exhaustive. Okay, so most commonly kidney disease like glomerulonephritis, amyloidosis, immune-mediated hemolytic anemia, many a time hyperadenocorticism when glucocorticoids or cortisol levels are increased, many times due to some parasites like diphtheria mimetis or angiostrongalus, right? So these all are responsible for damaged endothelial cells, and ultimately they will lead to formation of a thrombus within the blood vessels wall, and ultimately within the vasculatures, and ultimately they will leads to formation of thrombus as well as thromboembolism. In case of humans, atherosclerosis, in case of pigs, atherosclerosis are also responsible for this thromboembolism, right? Then the source of emboli are actually valvular endocarditis. What is this? We will discuss little bit later in the circulatory system classes. Okay, but in general, valvular means there will be inflammation of valves present in the heart. Okay, then some hepatic abscess, when they get ruptured inside the blood vessels, ultimately they will lead to formation of a embolism, and they are most commonly in the cattle. Okay, so these are the some list of etiology which are responsible for formation of a thromboembolism. Okay, so here you can see this is a cut section of a lung. Okay, and here you can see this is blood vessels wall, and this blood vessels was actually dissected. They actually get opened. Okay, and here you can see this is a internal surface of the blood vessels, and this one is actually blood vessel. This one is actually embolus. Sorry, this is actually thrombus. Okay, here you can see this is a very large mass present within the blood vessels. Very large mass present within the blood vessels. Okay, so this is known as thromboembolism. Okay, then pulmonary infarct. So what do you mean by infarct? What do you mean by infraction?
Blood loss.
Area of
Ischemia plus necrosis.
Very good, right?
Ischemic necrosis.
Yes, very good, very good. So pulmonary infarction or infarction is actually area of ischemic necrosis when the blood supply is actually lost or venous drainage is actually not proper. In both the cases, ultimately what happens? The cells will suffer from hypoxia or anoxia, and ultimately that cells will get died. Okay. So generally, in case of lung, there are dual blood supply. Particularly, lung tissue are actually supplied with the pulmonary arteries as well as bronchial arteries, right? So due to this dual blood supply, generally infections are quite rare in case of lung, but occasionally such type of or rarely such type of lesions are noted inside the lung. And here you can see this is lung, and this all black multifocal to coalescing area are actually showing area of infraction. Okay, and we have all learned that in particularly soft tissues, spongy tissues like lung, infractions are generally reddish in color, generally blackish in color, because there is enough space for accumulation of blood. So generally it will take a slightly darker color. While in solid organs like kidney, generally infractions are white in color because there is no space for accumulation of blood. So ultimately they become white in color. Okay, then next point is equine exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage, right? So name itself indicate this is a very specific disease of equine, particularly race horses. Okay, and here what happened? Due to heavy exercise, that you will found some hemorrhages inside the lungs as well as inside the bronchi and trachea. Okay, so this equine exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage is quite common in race horses, and according to one study, almost 75% of race horses have endoscopically detectable blood in their airways following single post-race examination. Right, so you can imagine how stressful the race will be. Okay, so generally race is comparatively stressful in particularly equines, and and this heavy exercise actually leads to a very minute pulmonary hemorrhages, but in some cases these hemorrhages are actually quite large and they can easily detectable by naked eye. And in this particular conditions, most commonly this dorsal and the caudal portion, right? This is anterior one, this is posterior, right? So cranial, caudal. This is dorsal and this is ventral. Okay. So generally, most commonly this hemorrhage occurs on this dorsal side, and particularly they are more commonly involved the caudal portion. They are more commonly involved the caudal portion. Okay. So most commonly in case of equine, the hemorrhage are most commonly found on the dorso and caudal side. Okay, so dorso-caudal area. Here also you can see this is again lung. This is dorsal side, this is caudal side, this is anterior, this is posterior, this is caudal, this is cranial, and you can just compare this caudal and dorsal portions are markedly affected, and they are showing marked hemorrhages. Okay, they are showing marked hemorrhages. Okay, now we will move towards airway disease. So name itself indicate airway means we are talking about bronchi, bronchioles, or both, right? So the major consequence of this disease are coughing, airway obstructions, and impairment of lung defense, right? So whenever this bronchi and bronchioles are get affected, when they are involved in any disease process, ultimately this will lead to coughing, airway obstructions, and impairment of lung disease. Here you can see these are some most common airway disease of domestic animals are listed here. Acute tracheobronchitis of a dog, chronic bronchitis of a dog, eosinophilic bronchopneumopathy of dogs, feline asthma, recurrent airway obstructions in horses, and some parasitic disease of different livestock animals. Okay, so these are the some common airway disease, but we will discuss some of them. So first we will discuss about chronic bronchitis in dog. Okay, so chronic bronchitis name itself indicate this is chronic, right? So they are comparatively longer in durations, and bronchitis is an inflammation of a bronchi. Okay, so this is common condition in older, small, and medium-sized dog. And what are the clinical signs? How will you identify? This is a case of chronic bronchitis, right? So if dog, either small or medium-sized dog, if suffered from chronic bronchitis, then it will show a chronic productive or non-productive cough. Exercise intolerance. What it mean? It means if you go for some walking, or uh, if you force the dog for running, then it will easily tired, right? It will not do the proper work. It will get easily tired. If you go for running, then it will generally remain behind to you, right? So this is known as exercise intolerance. Okay, then expiratory or inspiratory wheezes, right? So typical whistle like sound will be heard when you go for auscultation of a thoracic cavity when dog is suffered from chronic bronchitis. Okay, then reduced expiratory airflow, right? So when dog is forced, when they try to remove the air from the lungs, in that case air will not come out properly. Okay, then hypoxemia means ultimately oxygen saturation will be decreased due to chronic bronchitis. The etiology of this chronic bronchitis in case of dogs are rarely identified. Okay, but some of the predisposing factors which can lead to chronic bronchitis are dry air. Okay, then airborne pollutants, environmental, tobacco smoke, right? So then chronic, which leads to aspiration and some viral infections predisposed. Okay, grossly what you will find from chronic bronchitis, and if you bronchioles are filled with the mucous or mucopollutant exudate. And in severe cases, the underlying mucosa will show hyperemia. It means the blood vessels are get filled with the blood. Okay, and the mucosa will be thickened. It may be edematous, or sometimes it may become granular. Microscopically, what you will find in case of chronic bronchitis, microscopically, the bronchial mucosa is showing edema, as well as, depending upon the severity, the mucosa are actually infiltrated with the inflammatory cells. In initial case, generally there will be infiltration of a neutrophils, but as time advanced, slowly and slowly these neutrophils will be replaced by lymphocytes as well as plasma cells, and sometimes with the small amount of macrophages. Okay. And then you will also find submucosal gland, particularly bronchial glands, will show hyperplasia and hypertrophy. And as we know, when mucopollutant discharge, the mucus is increased. Ultimately, why this increase? Because the goblet cells numbers are increased. These goblet cells will secrete this mucus. So ultimately, you will find hyperplasia of goblet cells. And when the severity is actually more, when this particularly when severity is more, in that case, what you will find? You will find squamous metaplasia of the surface, right? So normally you will find ciliated, pseudostratified, or cuboidal epithelium. But when severity is more, in that case, when this irritation is continuous and persists for a very longer period of time, in that case, that epithelium will be replaced with the squamous epithelium. Okay. Then what happens if this chronic bronchitis persists for a very longer period of time and they are actually not resolved properly? Then in that case, this chronic bronchitis will be converted into bronchiectasis, that we'll discuss little bit later on, or bronchopneumonia, or atelectasis, or pulmonary hypertension, right? So this bronchiectasis, bronchopneumonia, alveolar atelectasis, or pulmonary hypertensions are sequelae of chronic bronchitis in dog. Okay, the next condition is eosinophilic bronchopneumopathy. Okay, so name itself indicate this is related to bronchi as well as alveoli, and the main infiltrating cells are eosinophils, or the culprits are eosinophils, right? So this eosinophilic bronchopneumopathy is actually uncommon steroid responsive conditions of young dog. What do you mean by steroid responsive? Means if we start the steroid treatment like glucocorticoids like prednisolone, dexamethasone, in that case dog will respond, right? When we start the steroids, ultimately the typical coughing will be disappeared, right? But if you stop this particular steroid, then ultimately it will again reappear. So they are known as steroid responsive conditions. Okay. So how the eosinophilic bronchopneumopathy will manifest it as chronic gagging, coughing, difficulty in breathing, nasal discharge, and many a time, if you go for complete blood count CBC, in that case, what you will find? You will find increased number of eosinophils into the circulations. Absolute numbers of eosinophils will be increased along with the neutrophils count. Right, so both neutrophils and eosinophils, both cells are increased into the circulation. Okay, the eosinophilic bronchopneumopathy is perhaps the most common cause of bronchiectasis in dogs. Right. So, what is bronchiectasis? That we'll discuss little bit later on. Okay, so the next topic is bronchiectasis. Okay, so name itself indicate bronchiectasis. Bronchi means we are talking about bronchi, ectasis means dilatation. Okay, but here what happened? There is a permanent dilatation of a bronchi, right? The bronchiectasis means permanent dilatation of a bronchi, dilation of a bronchi as a result of chronic bronchial obstructions and infection. Right, so when obstructions are remain for a very longer period of time, ultimately the muscles and some cartilage portions are get degraded, and ultimately this will lead to permanent dilatation of a bronchi. Right, so this bronchiectasis is a relatively common condition in cattle and in case of dog, and the destruction of a bronchial wall with the luminal obstructions by exudate is the key development of bronchiectasis and leads to their permanent dilatation. Okay, so the neutrophils and eosinophils derived lytic enzymes like proteases and oxygen radicals are responsible for degradations of the muscles and cartilage which are present inside the bronchi and bronchioles, and due to this loss of these muscles and cartilage, ultimately the diameter of a bronchi will be increased and they are filled with the exudate. So here you can see this is schematic diagrams of a bronchi, of a normal bronchi as well as of a bronchiectasis. Okay, so here you can see this is comparatively healthy bronchus. This is a lumen, and this is a lining mucosa. Here you can see this is showing typical ciliated epithelial cells. Okay, and inside the submucosa you can find this type of bronchial glands, and there are some smooth muscles as well as cartilage, right? So these smooth muscles are actually responsible for maintaining their normal diameter, right? So whenever this bronchi can decrease the diameter by constrictions and they can increase their diameter by relaxation, right? So many a time whenever there is a bronchospasm, spasm means contractions, in that case the lumen will be decreased, and this is due to constrictions of the smooth muscles, right? But if in some conditions, if these muscles are get degraded, if this cartilage are get degraded, in this case what happen? The bronchi, this bronchus will not maintain their shape and as well as their lumen diameters, and ultimately due to loss of their muscles and cartilage, ultimately the diameter will be increased, and this will lead to formation of a bronchiectasis. Here you can see this is schematic diagram. Here what happened? Inside the lumen there will be infiltration of a neutrophils, eosinophils and some other inflammatory cells. This eosinophils, neutrophils and inflammatory cells will release some proteolytic enzymes like proteases and elastase and other metallomatrix proteases enzymes, and ultimately these enzymes will lead to destructions of epithelial cells as well as mucosal glands, and finally it will reach to the smooth muscles as well as cartilage, and ultimately it will destroy all these muscles and cartilage. So ultimately what happens? There will be no strength are available. So ultimately the lumen of a bronchus or bronchi will be get enlarged, and ultimately they will filled with the exudate, and this is known as bronchiectasis. And what happen if this lumen of this bronchi or bronchioles are obstructed with the exudate or any foreign material? What happen? What will be the sequelae of this bronchiectasis? We have already learned in last few classes, right? So if trachea or bronchi or bronchioles, if they are obstructed by foreign bodies or any exudate material, in that case what happen? The depending part of the lung will show typical atelectasis. It will show typical atelectasis, right? So grossly what you will find? Grossly you will find that dilated bronchioles are filled with the yellow, green, creamy. Many a time these exudate are converted into cheese-like material or very dry exudate. Okay, macroscopically what you will find? Macroscopically the lumen of a bronchus or bronchi are filled with the mucus, cellular debris, leukocytes and occasionally blood. Why this happen? Because these lumens are initially infiltrated with the inflammatory cells like neutrophils, eosinophils. Okay, they will release the lytic enzymes like proteases, elastase and some other metallomatrix proteases, and ultimately they will degrade our epithelial mucosa as well as submucosal glands as well as muscles and cartilage, and ultimately all these degraded materials are get accumulated inside the lumen, right? So we'll find cellular debris. Okay, then the epithelium are sometimes show typical necrosis or attenuations or ulcerations, or in some cases when the irritations persist, body will try to replace our ciliated epithelium with the more hardy epitheliums like squamous epithelium. So you will find squamous metaplasia. So here you can see this is the lung. Okay. Okay. So here which portion is normal? This one or this one? The typically dark brown or this light area? Which one is abnormal? This dark brown area is normal or this one is normal?
Sir, dark brown abnormal.
Very good, right? So this dark brown area is actually abnormal, right? And what you are appreciate in this particular picture, this dark brown area is showing. Why this dark brown is abnormal? Because they are depressed than normal. Here you can see this is typical well demarcated area. This area is actually get depressed and they become non-spongy. If you touch such type of lung, it become non-spongy. And why this happen? Because of atelectasis. Because this exudate which is present inside the bronchi or bronchus, it will obstruct the lumen of a bronchi, will show typical atelectasis, right? So here you can see this is area of consolidation or atelectasis, and all this area here, right? You can see this particular area. This is actually typical of bronchiectasis. If you cut this particular surface, in that case, the bronchi are actually filled with the exudate, right? Bronchi are filled with the exudate. Many a time you have to differentiate this condition with the abscess, pulmonary abscesses, right? In case of pulmonary abscesses, what happen? They are generally localized. They are present only in one location, right? And if you open, they are generally circular and location. They are actually not penetrated inside. They are actually not showing typical tract. Okay, in case of abscess, but you open bronchiectasis, in that case, definitely they are also showing presence of exudate pus, but it will move along with the bronchi or bronchioles. Okay, they will show the tracks. They will move along with the bronchi or bronchioles. So on basis of that, you can easily differentiate. Okay, this is abscess or this is bronchiectasis. In case of abscess, it will be localized, present on the one place only, while in case of bronchiectasis, it will move along with the bronchi or bronchioles. So you will find the track, right? Here also you can see this is a cut section of a lung, and this all here you can see these are the bronchi, and these bronchus are actually filled with the exudate. All these white materials are actually exudate, right? So here what happened? Most of these bronchi are actually filled with the exudate. So ultimately the depending part of the lung will show atelectasis. Okay. Then can you say the probable species? Right? Here you can see the interlobular septa is actually prominent. Here also, right? So most probably this is a species will be either cattle or pig, but the bronchiectasis are comparatively more common in cattle and dogs. So most probably this is actually common. The most probable species will be cattle in this case. The next one is bronchiolitis obliterans. Okay, bronchiolitis obliterans. So this bronchiolitis obliterans is actually sequelae of chronic bronchiolar damage. This is a sequelae of chronic bronchiolar damage. So in case of bronchiolitis obliterans, what you will find? You will find presence of fibrous polyp occluding the bronchiolar lumen. Right? Or bronchiolar lumens are actually occluded with the polyp, fibrous polyp. And what do you mean by polyp? Polyp means when they have very small stalk, when attachment is actually small and the distal part is comparatively very large. Just like if you hold one balloon which is actually filled with the water, right? So when the holding side will be comparatively very narrow, very small, and the below portion will be comparatively very large. Okay, so this is known as polyp-like mass. So here also same. What you will find in case of bronchiolitis obliterans, what you will find? You will find fibrous polyp that occluding the bronchiolar. What would happen? Infection or any type of inflammation occurs inside the bronchi or bronchiole. Ultimately, this will increase the vascular permeability. When vascular permeability increases, ultimately what happens? There will be exudation of a plasma as well as fibrin from the blood vessels, and this fibrin will be accumulated inside the lumen, over the mucosa, right? In our normal defense mechanism, what happens? This macrophages and other inflammatory cells will come at the sites and they will try to remove this fibrin, right, which is come out from the blood vessels at the site of inflammation. But if this macrophages and other inflammatory cells are unable to remove this particular fibrin, which is already deposited inside the lumen, in that case, if time is actually lapse and fibrins get deposited and they are not removed by our inflammatory cell, in that case, what happens? The another mechanism will be initiated. In that case, the fibroblast will be penetrate inside the this fibrin depositions, and ultimately they will try to replicate at the sites, and slowly this fibroblast replications will leads to formation of a fibrous polyp, right? This will leads to formation of a fibrous polyp, and lastly this fibrous polyp will be covered with the normal healthy respiratory mucosa, right? So here you can see this is a typical example. Okay, first we will discuss about a schematic diagram. Here you can see this is schematic diagram. Okay, and this is normal ciliated epithelium, right? But suppose if there is any inflammation occurs inside the bronchus or bronchioles, in that case vascular permeability will be increased, and due to increase of vascular permeability there will be deposition of a fibrin and other fluid. In normal healthy condition, this fibrin will be removed by our inflammatory cells like neutrophils as well as macrophages. But in some condition, if they are not removed within time, in that case, here you can see this fibroblast will be penetrate this particular mass, and ultimately they will multiply, and after this multiplication this entire mass will be converted into fibrous polyp. Here you can see this is fibrous tissue, these are the blood vessels, and this entire fibrous tissue are covered with the respiratory epithelium. Okay, is obliterans. Okay, the next one is recurrent airway obstruction. The next topic is recurrent airway obstruction. Okay, so recurrent airway obstruction, name itself indicate this is actually recurrent, means animal will show the sign of airway obstructions, then again it will be recovered. After a few days, again it will show the signs of airway obstruction, right? So here what happened? There will be reoccurrence of the process. So recurrent airway obstructions is a common condition of a mature horses, and the synonym of this recurrent airway obstruction is a hives, broken wind, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, chronic bronchiolitis emphysema complex, chronic or alveolar emphysema. Okay, so this recurrent airway obstruction is a very specific condition of a mature horse, and most of the time this is actually not non-septic, means mostly they are not associated with any bacterial infections or any other infections, but still this will lead to inflammatory airway disease of an adult horse, and this is characterized by airway hyperresponsiveness, right? What happened? The airways, particularly bronchi and bronchiole, it will show bronchospasm, it will show narrow frequent recurrent narrowing of the lumen, and episodes of reversible airway obstructions resulting from bronchospasm, right? So here what happened? There will be accumulation of a mucus as well as there will be bronchospasms, and due to both these reasons, ultimately the lumens will be get obstruction, and this will lead to recurrent airway obstruction. Okay, so most commonly when this recurrent airway obstructions occurs in mature horses, this will lead to chronic cough, increased expiratory efforts, wheezing sound, means if you go for auscultation you will find typical whistles like sound, then variable nasal discharge, and exercise intolerance because of hypoxia is decreased due to recurrent obstructions of the bronchi. The lesions are most commonly encountered in small bronchioles, and if you go for gross examination, many a time you will find presence of a mucus or mucus mixed exudate inside the small bronchi. And microscopically, what you will find? Microscopically, the mucus is actually mixed with the neutrophils, and many a time you will also find hyperplasia of goblet cells. Okay, and this mucus and mucus mixed exudates, it will obstruct the small lumen of a small bronchioles. The exact cause of this recurrent airway obstructions is not yet identified, but probably they are associated with the allergic reaction. Okay, and many a time, what type of these allergens are still not completely elucidated. So here you can see this is a horse which is suffered from recurrent airway obstructions, and many a time, if you see closely, the horse which are affected from recurrent airway obstructions or heave or from broken wind, many a time you will find such type of typical lines. They are also known as heaves lines. They are also known as heave line. When the animals are suffered for a very longer period of time with this particular disease, in that case, what happened? Due to this respiratory muscles, they have to work more as compared to normals, and due to this hypertrophy, the such type of lines are actually created, right? Due to muscles hypertrophy, because to remove the gas from the lungs, muscles have to work more than normal, right? So due to the more workload, ultimately these muscles are showing typical hypertrophy, and due to this hypertrophy you will find this type of line, and this is known as Hughes lines. This is known as Hughes lines. Okay, so due to excessive workload of respiratory muscles to remove the air from the lungs, such type of hypertrophy occurs, and this will lead to formation of such type of Hughes line. Here you can see this is microscopic picture of a recurrent airway obstruction. And in case of recurrent airway obstructions, what happened? Here you can see this is a bronchus, particularly small bronchioles, and these small bronchioles are filled with the mucus and some inflammatory exudate. Okay, some inflammatory cells. Okay, and this is actually special stain where this particular mucus are stained with the Alcian blue stain. Right, so here you can see these bronchioles are completely, the lumens of the bronchioles are completely occluded by the mucus, right? And many a time what happens, this mucus will be slowly reabsorbed or removed by inflammatory cells. So ultimately, many a time this bronchial lumen will be cleared. But again, after some time, again this bronchus will be again occluded by this mucus and other exudates, right? So due to this reason, due to continuous reoccurrence, the name given a recurrent airway obstruction. Okay, then now we will move towards pneumonia. Okay, so pneumonia is actually most important topic for both examination point of view as well as practical point of view. Okay, so pneumonia is a simple term. Sorry. So pneumonia is actually inflammation of a lungs. And this pneumonia or inflammation of lung can be classified in several ways. First, we'll discuss about morphological patterns. On the basis of morphological patterns, the inflammation of lung or the pneumonia is again classified into bronchopneumonia, interstitial pneumonia, embolic pneumonia, or granulomatous pneumonia. Okay, so here what happened, particularly in morphological pattern, which site of the lungs are more commonly involved. Okay, so in case of bronchopneumonia, most commonly the cranial portion are most commonly involved. In interstitial pneumonia, the alveolar septa are most commonly involved. In embolic pneumonia, generally you will find shower of the emboli. So ultimately, major part of the lungs will be involved. In case of granulomatous pneumonia, you will find typical granulomas. Okay, then on the basis of histology, the pneumonia are again classified: suppurative pneumonia, granulomatous pneumonia, necrotizing pneumonia, proliferative pneumonia, and fibrosing pneumonia. Right? So fibrinous means exudate will be fibrous from the blood circulation. Pneumonia means name itself indicate the exudate will be pus, and mainly due to severe infiltration of a neutrophils. In case of granulomatous pneumonia, what you will find causative granulomas, and most commonly macroscopically what you will find infiltration of a macrophages, and in some cases this macrophage will form multinucleated giant cells. In case of necrotizing pneumonia, you will find necrosis. In case of proliferative pneumonia, there will be hyperplasia of type 2 pneumocytes or club cells. And in fibrosing pneumonia, whenever there is excessive fibrosis occurs inside the lungs, like due to equine herpes virus 5, this will lead to severe fibrosing pneumonia. Okay, so on basis of etiology, again pneumonia can be classified into viral pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, parasitic pneumonia, toxic pneumonia, and allergic pneumonia. Right. So name itself indicate viral means etiology will be virus. In case of bacterial pneumonia, it will be bacteria. In parasitic, it will be parasites. Some toxic compounds are responsible for formation of a toxic pneumonia, and allergic conditions or some allergens may lead to development of a allergic pneumonia. Okay, on basis of duration, pneumonia again classified into acute, subacute, or chronic pneumonia. And on basis of epidemiological patterns, pneumonia can be classified into shipping fever or enzootic pneumonia. Okay, here you can see these are some schematic diagrams. Okay, and some patterns of pneumonia and lung lesions, right? In which type of pneumonia, which part of the lungs are actually involved, right? So to understand this particular pneumonia, you have to remember that which are the cranial portion, which are the caudal portion, which are the anterior, which are the posterior, which are the dorsal, which are the ventrals. Okay, so here you can see this is, okay, so this is trachea, and from this trachea you will find the bronchi and bronchioles. Okay, so at the site of trachea, where actually trachea entered inside the lung, they are considered as a, this one considered as a anterior or cranial portion. This is a caudal portion or posterior portion. Okay, this one, this is dorsal side, so this will be considered as a dorsal, and this one will be considered as a ventral. Okay, so this is comparatively normal healthy lung. Okay, now in case of bronchopneumonia, here you can see these two figures are case of bronchopneumonia. Okay, and in case of bronchopneumonia, the most commonly the cranial and caudal, the posterior, sorry, the ventral. Okay, cranioventral. So anterior portion and the ventral portion of the lungs are more commonly involved in case of bronchopneumonia, right? So in case of superiority bronchopneumonia, name itself indicate there will be presence of pus, and in case of fibrinous bronchopneumonia, there will be fibrin will be the predominant exudate. Okay, so in both cases of bronchopneumonia, generally this cranial and the ventral portions are more commonly affected. So cranioventral portions of lungs are affected. Okay, in case of interstitial pneumonia, you can see entire lung is involved. Entire lung is involved, but here the most importantly, the alveolar septa are showing thickening. Okay, then embolic pneumonia. Here generally what happens, there will be embolic shower. Okay, most commonly due to valvular endocarditis, the bacterial pathogens are continuously bombarding into the lungs, and ultimately due to these reasons, randomly any lobe of lungs can be affected. And here you can see this all dark spots are showing focal area of pneumonia. Okay, in case of granulomatous pneumonia, any lung lobules can be affected, and if you open such type of lung, particularly lesions, then you will find typical presence of cheese-like exudate. Tumor metastases are again frequent in case of lungs, and metastasis again, just like embolic shower, it can be seen in any part of the lung. In porcine fibrinous pleuropneumonia, most commonly these middle portions are more commonly involved. In case of verminous pneumonia, generally these caudal lungs are more commonly affected. In aspiratory pneumonia, આપણે જે કહીએ ને કે અનાળે ગયું છે, અનાળી જાય એટલે means કે falsely the food materials will enter into the trachea rather than it will go into the esophagus. Okay, so here more commonly unilateral cranial portions are more commonly affected.